As you're thinking through assessments for your social media management courses, we wanted to offer a few things that it would be helpful for you to think about as you're working towards the ideal assessment plan and some of the assessment comparisons. So our goals for today are, first of all, to give you an opportunity to align your outcomes and assessments as part of your course design, to select some instructional and assessment strategies that will help to foster some ongoing student engagement and motivation in your course. We'd like to give you an opportunity to identify some options for authentic assessment in your courses, and then ultimately to develop an ideal assessment plan, which is going to be the homework before the next meeting. Since you've already had a chance to review your outcomes, the agenda for this video is going to be to talk, first of all, a little bit about course context and give you some things to think about in terms of what you'll be teaching and some of the contextual factors that come into play around that. We'll look a little bit at some basics of assessment that might be helpful to you. We'll talk about authentic assessment as sort of a goal for some of the courses that you'll be working on, and then finally review the ideal assessment plan a little bit as you get started on that. So to start with, when we do course design at Niagara College and program design, we use an integrated design approach, which really just means that we start with the course outcomes, as we've already done, because that really helps us to define what it is that we expect students to do at the end of the program or at the end of the course. Once we know what those outcomes are, we can start thinking about our feedback and assessment for students, because we'll have a much clearer idea of what students will need to be able to actually do to show us that they've met those course outcomes. And then finally, we can pull in the teaching and learning activities that are going to get students to the point where they can actually complete those assessments in a meaningful way. The other thing that we like to add to this fairly typical integrated design diagram is situational factors, because there are a lot of things that come into play situationally, contextually, that are things that will impact our courses. So they're things that are really important to think about as we are designing those assessments. So as you think about your course, we would invite you to think a little bit about how you are going to do your assessments. So that might be the type of assessment and the sequence of assessments and the kind of things that you're going to be doing across the semester, but also how those will be impacted by things like the format of the delivery, the number of students that you'll be working with, any other courses that might be associated with your course, so maybe courses that they're taking at the same time, or perhaps courses that they will be taking in the future. You might give some thought to the physical layout of the classroom and whether that's going to be a constraint in any meaningful way or something that might open up new options for you that weren't possible before. You can give some thought to the available resources and technologies. What sorts of things are students likely to have access to as part of the course, and what sorts of things are they not, and how might that affect how you're assessing students? But then also your own personal preferences and comfort. Teaching something in a way that you are deeply uncomfortable with doesn't always tend to work that great. So really thinking about how your own personal preferences might fit into that as well can be an important aspect of thinking about what that context looks like, and what sorts of situational things you might need to think about. So with that in mind, we'd like to give you the opportunity to think a little bit about the courses that you're teaching and think about what that assessment might look like as part of your course. And there are a couple of things that we would invite you to think about here. So first of all, what are the typical assessments that you might use in the course that you're developing? They might be assessments that you've used in courses before. They might not be, but they might be things that you've been thinking about as you've been thinking about the course that you're teaching and the outcomes that go with that. But what are the kinds of things you might be doing with students? What do they look like? What kinds of things will students be doing, and how will they be implemented? Alongside that, it can also be really helpful to think about what do you like about those assessments? Why do you use them? So what are the things that students are going to get out of them? Why do these particular assessments really reflect the outcomes in the course and bring value to students and to the course as a whole? But alongside that, it it can also be really helpful to think about in what ways are they challenging, and do you have any concerns about them? So there may be things about the assessments that are going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. Maybe that's the grading piece, maybe that's how you're going to introduce it with students, maybe there's a lot of flexibility and things could go awry. Whatever that looks like, give some thought to that. And we'd invite you to stop the video now if you would like to just sit down with that for a minute and really think about what are the things that you are going to be doing with your students assessment-wise. What's front of mind for you? So once you've had a chance to think about your assessments generally, it can also be helpful to take some time to reflect on what those assessments are and how they're going to work in your course. And in particular, there are 3 questions that we like to ask around this. The first one is, what type of skill do your assessments typically emphasize? Be that writing skills, perhaps physical skills that students have to complete in the class, and why is that the case? It may be that the things that students are doing in class are exactly the things that they will have to do on the job, or at least pretty close to it. So very specific skills are represented because that's what they're going to be doing in the future. But it may also be that in some cases we default to a particular kind of assessment because that's the kind of assessment that we did in school or we're familiar with or we've typically done in the past. And so really thinking about the why can help to highlight when how we've set up our assessments is the kind of thing that is going to work really well for showing outcomes in the course, or perhaps in some of those instances where maybe we've defaulted to one particular type of assessment rather than another. And out of that, there are 2 really important questions. The first one is, what type of learner does that reward? And the second one is, what type of learner might struggle with these assessments? So it is worth finding a balance between some of these different questions and really thinking about, are there ways that the kind of things that we're doing in class can be set out so that students with different preferences, with different skills, with different sort of approaches to learning might be better represented within our classrooms. And that doesn't have to go against, those specific things that have to happen because they're the things that they are going to do in jobs in the future. But it can be really helpful to sit down and think about those things from an accessibility and an inclusivity perspective to make sure that all students have the opportunity to show what they know in ways that are useful and beneficial and meaningful for them. All right, so with that considered, another thing that we like to talk about are types of assessment. And as we're thinking about assessment with the idea of putting together an ideal assessment plan, a lot of what we're talking about are going to be summative assessments. So summative assessments are the ones that are typically very focused on outcomes and showing that students have met outcomes. They're designed to measure learning at a particular point in time. And these are typically the assessments that are quantitative and are graded. So these are your projects, your tests, your written assignments that students are handing in, your presentations. Anything that's a really sort of specific assessment in the class and has a grade attached to it is usually a summative assessment. Beyond that, though, we would encourage you to think about formative assessments as well, even though they're not necessarily graded and not necessarily the kind of thing that will show up on the ideal assessment plan. Thinking about what those formative pieces look like can be really important as well, because these are the pieces that are focused on diagnostics across the semester. So really getting a sense of where students are, what they're doing well with, what they're struggling with, and helping them to identify those things as well, because these are typically assessments that measure learning as it's happening, as it's in progress, and making sure that things are carrying on through the class as was intended. So these are typically assessments that are qualitative, and they're often assessments that are ungraded as well. And so even though these might not show up in your ideal assessment plan because there aren't grades attached to them, and they might happen more sort of organically across a semester or across a course, thinking about what these pieces look like on the formative side of things is really important, because those are the things that really help to figure out, where students are at, how they're doing with the course, and how they can build towards really being able to accomplish those summative pieces as they show up throughout the semester. Another piece that we would like you to think about as you're working on your ideal assessment plan is the idea of authentic assessment. Now, based on the social media management program and a lot of what you've been talking about already, authentic assessment is already front of mind for a lot of you. And authentic assessment is really just a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. So as you've been talking about having students do campaigns and engage with social media and all of those things that they're going to have to do in the job when they finally come to it, that's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about authentic assessment. And so traditional assessment is something that is certainly useful in a lot of contexts, but the more we can think about that authentic assessment piece, particularly with a program like this, the better. The idea here is that as we are looking at authentic assessment, we are moving from options where we might, say, select a response in a traditional assessment and instead move towards performing a task. We might move from an assessment that is perhaps a little bit more contrived and into something that is a little bit more focused on that real life application that's going to happen when they finally come out of the program. We're moving from recall and recognition to actual construction or application and doing something in a more practical, often more meaningful kind of way. We're moving from something that is fairly teacher structured through to something that is much more student driven, where they have a lot more say in what they're doing and how they're doing it, which is such a hugely valuable part of learning. And then moving from that indirect evidence piece where, we can assume that students know what they're going to do because they can write about it or talk about it, through to actually being able to see that in practice, which is a huge boon for being able to sort of measure that students can actually do the things that we want them to do in the end. So we've given you a number of different things to think about there, all of which are really important when we actually come to the work of designing assessments. So with that piece in mind, we would ask you to reflect on your course outcomes and consider a couple of different questions. The first one is, what specific skills or abilities will students need to demonstrate for each outcome, and at what level? So that level piece is really important here because if we are dealing with students early in the program, that level is probably going to be different than when they're doing that capstone project at the end. So really thinking about what level and what's going to be reasonable for students who are at different points in the program is important towards figuring out what an appropriate assessment is. And then, of course, we're also looking for those specific skills and abilities. And one thing that can be really helpful is looking at the outcomes. If you look at the verbs that are attached to them, those verbs will often give you a hint as to what kind of assessments are going to be useful. So if students have to be able to write something, then you're probably going to have some kind of an assessment that involves writing, be that a report, some social media content, that could be any number of different things. The second question we'd ask you to think about is what skills or abilities might be assessed in the same assessment. So this doesn't necessarily have to be one assessment per outcome, and in fact, given the number of outcomes and objectives for any given course, that is often quite impractical. So really thinking about the ways that some of these different outcomes can show up in different assessments is an important thing for being able to tie things together, but also keep the grading relatively manageable for you as an instructor. And then the third thing we would talk about are what assessments should be summative and how might they be supported through formative assessments. So again, thinking about what are the big pieces that are going to be measured, how are they going to be measured, and where are they going to be measured? But what are the other pieces that might happen in the course that will help to build that scaffold to move students through the skills, through the abilities, to a place where they can actually complete those summative assessments in a way that is useful and meaningful and that allows them to be supportive in learning throughout the course? And that brings us to the point where we can start to bring all of these pieces together into the ideal assessment plan. So we've given you a number of big picture things to think about and to work with. You've got your outcomes, you've got the specific skills and abilities that are represented in those outcomes and the things that students will actually have to be able to accomplish. You've got the levels at which they will have to accomplish things based on sort of where they are in the program at any given point in time. We've got the evidence piece where we're actually looking for students to be able to do particular things, and also the authenticity piece where the assessments that students are working on are representative, hopefully, of things that they will be doing in the future. And we've also got some really practical concerns and some smaller scale things. So what are the values of these assessments? How much value are we going to put on a particular assessment in the context of the course? Which things are perhaps worth more than others or have more value than others? There's also some things here around mode of delivery that are worth thinking about. So all of those contextual pieces that we talked about at the beginning, how do those factor into the kind of assessments you'll be doing with your students? We'd love for you to think about timing as well. So when are these going to happen over the course of the semester? And at the same time, as you're working out when your assessments are going to happen, how do those match with other assessments in other courses to maybe make it a little bit easier and perhaps a little bit less stressful for students to complete their work, particularly during some of those busy periods? And then finally, we've got that scaffolding piece that we just talked about, where there might be pieces of assessments that happen in a formative way, or smaller, less valuable assessments that happen earlier in the semester that ultimately help guide students towards completing some of those bigger or more valuable assessments a little bit later on. So with all of that set out, we would love for you to think about your ideal assessment plan now, and that is the first bit of homework that we will have for the next meeting. So here you can reflect on your outcomes and give some thought to what an ideal assessment plan would look like for your course over the course of the semester. And when we talk about an ideal assessment plan, we do actually mean ideal, and often find that it's really helpful to start from a fairly pie-in-the-sky approach to thinking about assessment. So we would invite you to think about, in an ideal world, what would that acceptable evidence that students have learned look like? And what assessments would you give to students to really show that they've learned those things? And we would love for you to think about that, first of all, in terms of what you would do with students if you weren't concerned about some of those situational or contextual factors that we talked about early on. So if you weren't worried about grading time or mode of delivery or resources or any of those other pieces, what would absolutely, definitively, ideally show you what students have learned in the class? And if it does come down to it and the things that you're thinking of are not possible, we're happy to chat about those things and find some ways to dial it back. But often starting with that really big picture, really idealistic sort of vision of what things could look like opens up some interesting opportunities. And then once you've had a chance to think about that, think about how and when those assessments would be delivered, and then also what constraints are holding you back. Maybe those are things that we can revisit. So you will have access in Teams to an ideal assessment plan that we would ask you to fill out. There is one per course, and we are going to ask you a couple of different things. The first one is, what are the major assessments in your course? And what outcomes do those assessments meet? And how much are they worth? So what are the really big things? That might be a big project at the end of the semester. It might be a couple of interrelated assessments across the semester. Whatever that looks like, that's what that top section is for. We'd also ask you to put down what additional assessments will your course have, and whether any of those assessments functions as a scaffold for some of the major ones. So these might be smaller quizzes or in-class activities, or little assessments that happen across the semester, but feel free to indicate those as well, and draw any connections that you can between them, just so that we know how those pieces fit together. And then at the bottom, we have a section for you to put when will your assessments be due. So really thinking about how those are spaced across the semester and making sure that there is enough time for all of the things that you want to do is important. The other thing that we would ask you to do as your second piece of homework, and as you're working on that, is alignment through the curriculum. So all of the things that you're doing, of course, are happening at the same time that things are happening in other courses. So it would be helpful to give some thought to how do your assessments work with others in your program. So are there assessments in your course that might be related to some of what other instructors are doing at the same time? And in particular, how do your assessments, say, build towards some of the things that students are going to do in later semesters or even in that big capstone course that will be happening at the end? We'd also ask you to think about whether there's any overlap between assessments. So as you are thinking about what you're doing in your class, there might be some chance to look at overlap there, but it's also worth thinking about from a program perspective as well. And also we're thinking about whether that overlap is necessary or not. And in some cases, overlap is absolutely necessary. If there are challenging skills that students need to know, or if they need to learn them at different levels and move from sort of introductory to mastery level knowledge, that overlap may be entirely appropriate and isn't a problem. But if there are places where it seems like maybe there's a little bit too much or that overlap is too significant, it might be worth thinking about minimizing. And then finally, we would love for you to think about whether there is scaffolding between assessments. And if there isn't, should there be? And again, that might be scaffolding within your own course and building students towards being able to complete particular higher value or more complex assessments by leading them through smaller assessments that develop those same skills. But that might also be something that you think about at a program level. So the things that you are teaching students, how will that help to scaffold them for success later in the program or in future courses that they might be taking? And to help with that, the second piece that we would ask you to do for homework is we have just an Excel sheet, actually, that we will also send you the link to, where we were going to ask you to put in the social media management assessment due dates by term, with the idea that from here, it will be relatively easy to see what's happening in the same week at any given in any given semester, but it will also be really helpful in terms of seeing what other assessments are being offered and how some of those curriculum pieces might fit together. So if you could do that while you are doing your ideal assessment plan, that would be great. And as always, if you have any questions, we're happy to chat. If you would like to connect about any of this, we're always happy to sit down and chat about assessments and what kind of things might work and not work in your courses. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we would be more than happy to chat anytime that works for you. Thanks, everybody.